And now we're going to move on to some video clips that we will reflect on. This morning at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, there was a panel hosted by University of Minnesota professor Larry Jacobs, and on the panel was newly elected Congresswoman from Minnesota 5, Ilhan Omar. We have former Minnesota Congressman Vin Weber, Minnesota Executive Director of WIN, Denise Cardinal, and GOP consultant Ben Golnick. And the four of them were on the panel and they answered some questions. First of all, let's go to Ilhan Omar as she speaks about how what the Democrats' values are affects the results of midterm elections. And we will also see a counter from Vin Weber saying that it's not necessarily what the candidates are in favor of, but rather a reflection on the negatives of the presidency.
We have been part, right, of this resistance the last 2 years to this politics of fear and the policies that are very destructive that are coming out of this administration. But we recognize that there is an opportunity for us to actually insist on a set of values that we know that the voters are interested in. And I think when there is an opportunity and a window, you take that. Because for the first time, I feel like we have an opportunity to talk to people about a different kind of progress that our country can really have, where we could have real investments in infrastructure and 21st century infrastructure, where we have real opportunities to make sure that here in the United States, no one should be worried about filing for bankruptcy because they get sick. Here in America, we should really have an opportunity for all of our young people to have a future that isn't shackled with student debt.
The progressive Democrats had a clear agenda. It's not necessarily my agenda, but it was clear. And I don't think anybody else in this, otherwise the election seemed to me to be largely devoid of clear substantive direction. The only thing I would say about that is, again, it's not unusual for a midterm election to be driven that way. My view of midterm election, we all would like to be positive and think that our elections are conducted on a positive, hopeful plan. Midterm elections, I think, are largely grievance elections. The marginal voters that turn out not because they're voting in favor of something they're excited about. You're maybe the exception, but they turn out because they're mad about something.
Yeah, so those are two pretty much entirely polar opposite views. I would say in terms of the midterms, these midterms specifically, I'd say that Weber is more accurate because I wouldn't say there was really an ideological takeaway, a strong ideological takeaway anyway, that you could take from this election, because you had moderates and centrist Democrats losing in Donnelly, in Sinema, in Nelson, and in Heitkamp, and in McCaskill. But you also had progressive losses with Gillum and Abrams and Beto O'Rourke, although he actually performed exactly about where he was polling. So when you look at that, I would not say that there is a strong ideological split in these midterm results. In that case, Weber is right. But in terms of the presidential election, I would say Omar might have something more to say about that, because I would say presidential elections are much less reflection of how the current presidency is doing.
I think I mostly agree with what Weber said. I think every political party wants their positions to be what rides them to victory, and that's not always the case. I think when the GOP won the House in the early 90s, for the first time in 50 years, they had this contract with America. They talked about the things they would do in the House. And I think it ended up being that the most Americans didn't know what the contract was, but it was what they campaigned on, but it didn't matter. Things with President Clinton probably put them over the edge anyway. And well, political parties love to have their messaging as what turns people out. A lot of times it is the unpopular president, or it's just changing attitudes or changing demographics, I think all of which filtered into this last election. I think what Congresswoman-elect Omar says about perhaps showing what the Democratic Party has to offer is something that should not be ignored. I think the Democrats have been out of power legislatively, in the House at least, for 8 years, and this gives them kind of a chance to kind of show people what they've got in terms of policy and things. Not necessarily in what gets passed, but in what gets presented. I do think that means they have to be careful with that. There's an argument to be made that when the GOP did the same thing in 2010, they pushed too far. They got seen as perhaps too extreme, and that might have hurt them in 2012. But definitely will be a chance to see what the Democrats have to offer in terms of infrastructure, in terms of healthcare, in terms of a balance to the GOP's influence the last couple of years.
I definitely think so. I think what Omar is saying might actually have some influence on these midterms, but not necessarily in the way that she's stating. I think in the individual races, I don't think what she's saying applies directly in this specific midterm. But I think in terms of the generic ballot between Democrats and Republicans, I think the Democrats should have more of a unified message, or something that people can actually point to the Democratic Party and say, that's what the Democrats stand for. I think we definitely have that with the GOP. I think we know that Trump is in favor of deregulation, and in terms of Trump specifically, in favor of tariffs. And he's in favor of a border wall. He's in favor of all of these things. He's not in favor of the ACA. I think the Democrats are not as strong as what they actually believe in, not just rejecting what Trump is doing, but actually having a very specific platform of their own. And I think that can go very powerfully in terms of expanding voter turnout. When people see Democrats as not just the resistance to Trump and the GOP, but actually as a force themselves that's advocating for a specific worldview that can actually latch on to people's enthusiasm and inspire voter turnout, I think that can be very powerful. Obviously, that's going to work differently in different states. Red states are going to be less responsive to a unified progressive message, while blue states and blue districts will accept it more easily. But I think having that strong, solid vision can appeal, especially if it's based on fundamental elements that most people agree on. 90% of Americans support universal background checks. About over half of Americans support Medicare for all. More than 60% of Americans support legalizing marijuana, and majority support infrastructure spending, which Ilhan Omar mentioned. And I think if those issues are focused on, and Democrats really are perceived as a party that's seeking something, not just rejecting something, I think that can lead to enthusiasm and future victories. What do you think?
I think wanting to reject something is what got the GOP to become so powerful after 6 years under Obama. I wonder if it's we love to think of a silver bullet that gets campaigns to work and what gets people to turn out to vote. I don't know. I don't think one exists really. I will say that I think that my intuition coming into this election was that the Democrats would be better off as a big tent party, as one that could appeal to those suburban women that that voted more for Hillary Clinton, as well as those elusive Obama-Trump voters. There was my belief that the Democrats could probably use positions like pre-existing conditions to perhaps take the best of both sides. That didn't happen. We saw kind of a shift of those red state Obama-Trump supporters kind of still going away from the Democratic Party, and those suburban areas going more to the Democrats. Perhaps it's time to rethink the big tent, and maybe obviously Democratic voters are not Republican voters, and if Republican voters were able to be energized for 8 years under Obama on repealing Obamacare, that might not have the same effect on Democratic voters. They're not going to. They might not turn out just because it's against Trump. They want results. They want health care and a higher minimum wage, and Democrats are going to have to cater to that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, especially about the Obama-Trump voters and pre-existing conditions. I would label a lot of the Obama-Trump voters as more of a populist demographic, and I think pre-existing conditions is one that would appeal to that populist sentiment. I also think infrastructure spending might be a big one. Whereas for the Romney-Clinton voters, that's more of a suburban, more affluent type of demographic, and I think in 2020, I think they'll be repelled by Trump's personality to a large extent. But in races with more establishment Republicans. I do think that's more of an establishment supporting demographic. So as Democrats, you have to balance that. Do you want to energize your base and Obama-Trump voters, or do you want to appeal to those kind of middle, more establishment Romney-Clinton voters? In my opinion, there's more to be had with independents, Obama-Trump voters, and the Democratic base, which in my opinion would be more receptive to a message that is populist and is advocating for a policy. The one drawback is losing potentially those Romney-Clinton voters.